Nothing in here is legal advice. Nancy, Juan, Adam are here in their personal capacity, not representing their respective employers. And I am also a tiny LP in a fund that invested in Coinbase, so just out of an abundance of disclosure for that. Nancy, why don't we start with you? Which top law firms? These are all questions that Clarence, myself, and the South Park Commons community came up with, so thank you all for those who contributed. Which top law firms are currently issuing legal opinions, as far as you know, for ICOs? Are you able to comment on that?
Nobody is. The top law firms are not really engaging in public token offerings in the US. We are all, as you know, first, let me just tell you a little bit about my background because I'm about to criticize the SEC. So I started my career at the Securities and Exchange Commission. I started out in trading and markets and then became counsel to two of the chairmen. So I love the SEC, but the SEC has no business being in the crypto world. They don't understand crypto at all, in my view. And so, but on the other hand, they're the ones that raised their hand and said, we're in charge. And right now, Congress is saying, hey, you know, we have a regulatory agency interested in this area and willing to kind of look at it all, so why don't we just deal with them? So, what happened at the end of December, early January, the SEC, who was pretty much silent in 2017, suddenly said, stop. All of these offerings are security offerings, and we're going to go after the entrepreneurs, we're going to go after the lawyers, we're going after the accountants, we're going after the iBankers. And we being the securities bar, immediately reached out to our clients saying, look, you got to put a stop on this, and we need to figure out how, in fact, you can get your token launched. And the only way we can do that is if we get the SEC's blessing. So the last 6 or 7 months, we've been very much engaged with the SEC on a number of fronts. One of them being Andreessen Horowitz reached out to the chairman when he made a speech at Stanford saying, we're going after the lawyers, we're going after the accountants. And sat down with him, and what the chairman of the SEC said was, look, form a small working group and come up with some suggestions. Pretty much saying, look, we're tired of talking to people about the Howey test. Put some real practical suggestions together. So Andreessen Horowitz, together with Union Square Ventures, sat down with 3 law firms, McDermott, Will & Emery, Perkins Coie, and Cooley, all of whom had a fairly significant crypto practice, together with 2 academics, Joe Grunfest and Adam, as well as NVCA, and we sat down and came up with a safe harbor that we felt we could, in fact, suggest to the SEC that they start their thinking in that direction. And we submitted that. Perkins Coie did a memo. And if any of you don't have those materials, just let me know. I can email them to you. They were supposed to be confidential and submitted to the SEC. Within days, they were public. In fact, as the newspaper reporters were calling me, I'm going, oh my God, how did that get out? And all of us were immediately reaching out to Andreessen Horowitz saying, we didn't send it, honest. But the really valuable work product at this point, and the reason I mention that is Director Hinman's speech that I'm sure everybody at least is familiar with or has heard about. Most of what he says in there came out of the safe harbor as well as the meetings that we had with him. So we felt that we made some progress, not a ton, but there's some progress going on. So in answer to your question, though, as a result of the regulatory turmoil in the US right now, and all I'm talking about is the SEC right now. We're not talking about FinCEN, the CFTC, the IRS, plus 50 states. It's an incredibly fragmented structure out there, and we need to be very careful. So top law firms are not, in fact, issuing opinions saying, hey, your token is not a security. It's just, we're aware of one small law firm in New York issuing them to exchanges saying, hey, this token's not a security, and whether or not that exchange can justifiably rely on that, I question, but that's it.
Okay. And just to follow up on that, so law firms are giving memos that talk about, are they not, that talk about, here are some guidelines, if you do this, your risk might be less, and
So we've stopped doing that.
oh wow.
So we used to issue risk assessment memos when we knew that the entrepreneurs were going to do what we called a pre-sale, which the SEC doesn't like calling it a pre-sale. We did it pursuant to a SAFT. The SEC doesn't like the SAFT. They're okay with purchase agreement. They just don't like the name SAFT. And we knew that the public token sale would occur down the line fairly soon. And we did, in fact, issue risk assessment memos, and we would talk about an analysis of the Howey test and what risks there were under the money service business regulations under FinCEN, and advise them, hey, these are the arguments you have in favor of it not being a security or being a money services business, or here are some counters that the SEC, should they decide to pursue you, this is what they're going to come after you at. So we stopped doing those mainly because people aren't doing the second step of the public token sale. And I'm sorry, I should sit on my hands. I talk with my hands. I meant to put bracelets on. I figured the jingling would bug me enough, but obviously not. So anyway, that's it.
All right, and so please save your burning questions for Nancy after Adam, we hear from Adam and Juan. Juan, I'd like to start with you next, if that's okay. So one of the questions from the audience was basically this: regulatory complexity in crypto has been Coinbase's biggest moat assertion so far. How long do you think that will last, and why?
Sure. So something that we've been doing from the beginning of the company is kind of committing the company to the most trusted, easiest to use, and that's been our brand name, and that's meant that we've adopted a certain standard when we think about who we hire, how we operate, how we advertise, what assets we are comfortable supporting on the platform, and our approach to regulation. So we've really, from day one, I joined the company in the beginning of 2014, we were deeply engaged in a multi-state licensing effort, and I think there was only one other company at the time who was engaging at that level.
Can you say which one?
That was Circle. So
yeah.
Coinbase and Circle were kind of the earliest two in the United States pushing the licensing, and Circle pivoted out of crypto, which turned out to be a big mistake, and they pivoted back in. But in any case, so we've always been very committed to that, and I do think we got ahead of a lot of other operators in the space who had a different philosophy that was maybe a little bit more fast and loose with the approach to regulatory issues. I think a lot of those folks have some of them have found that is not a successful operating model, particularly in the United States. Some of them have found that may be a successful operating model in other jurisdictions, which is an interesting subject matter that maybe is something worth talking about. Sure. But in the U.S., we are very aware that there are a number of other people who are licensed the way we are, or licensed the way we want to be licensed, and so we feel that the moat does not exist. We look at a number of companies out there who are involved in the sale of cryptocurrency that have the BIT license in New York, that have money transmission licenses, that have broker-dealer licenses that start to authorize some of the transactions in securities tokens. And so we are not sitting back on our laurels and kind of enjoying the company's success by any stretch. I think there's very much a feeling at Coinbase that we're an exciting place. We're growing fast. We're still very, very scrappy. You can ask any one of the people in the legal department. They're all doing 10 jobs. AJ will tell you that as well. There is a strong awareness that there are other people out there that have kind of already come across that moat.
Okay, good. Would you like to talk a little bit about, I'm sure many of us in the audience, even if we're not in crypto directly, either know people or maybe we dabble in trading on exchanges in Malta and so forth, perhaps, and how is that affecting Coinbase's thinking, or
well, I think one of the realities, and it's kind of picking up on what Nancy was just saying, is that the SEC has actually created an environment that is probably above average in terms of hostility towards kind of the question of how do securities laws apply to what we do. Most other regulators around the world, the SEC counterparts around the world, have not come out that strong. There are some exceptions.
Canada.
Maybe Canada. I'm sure you're more up to speed on what's going on in Canada than I am. But there are some exceptions. But by and large, Europe, for example, it's a huge jurisdiction. They have not quite caught up as much. There are operators in Hong Kong and places like Malta that have pretty substantial international footprints. They're doing a lot of stuff. So the question for us is really, can we operate lawfully? How do we operate lawfully internationally? And how can we take the smartest advantage of the reality? The laws are different in different jurisdictions, and it is probably not the right approach to assume that the United States law is the law that we have to voluntarily apply across the business everywhere, because it doesn't, and you don't have to operate that way, and you probably shouldn't. And so that is kind of what we are looking into very deeply all across the company. And I'll give you one example of an area where this is going to crop up, and we've said this is not private, we've said this publicly. We are fiercely looking at a spectrum of new assets that we'd like to add to the platform. It is very possible that these assets are supported in a regional piecemeal basis, depending on our understanding of the law. So it's very conceivable. And again, we have made no decisions about any of this stuff, so this is all hypotheticals.
Would you say the name of the
Right.
Juan, the one thing, can I
the
ask
names are
one?
public, right?
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
I could challenge you on one point, I think, on what the other countries are doing. A lot of them are watching what the SEC is doing, and we expect them to jump on the bandwagon to the extent that the SEC ever comes out with additional guidance, which may be a while. But people reach out to us from other jurisdictions saying, hey, when are you guys expecting this? We're considering something, but we're kind of watching. And by the way, on Canada, it's more Ontario. British Columbia is actually very open arms about crypto. So, but the OSC, I have a very dear friend there.
Well, I'll put it this way: you can you can't get legal opinions in the United States. I think there is still an opportunity to get legal opinions in other jurisdictions.
That's
So
true.
like as one measure, there are still places around the world that are not quite as sensitive
Right.
to the securities law issue. And navigating that as a company and as a developer, as an issuer, I think is a challenge. Realistically, if you're going to issue a token, this is something you have to be obsessed about, unfortunately, and you have to really start to think carefully about
Who
what
are
jurisdiction you're in.
non-lawyers in the room?
Yeah.
Just curious for a second. So just so folks know, a legal opinion is more or less when you ask your lawyer, can you opine on whether I can do something legally or not? And then they tell you in a letter to you, yes, we think you can do this more or less. But I would also say that with most legal opinions in the US, I mean, they've largely been quite watered down, where if you were to look at a legal opinion in a venture financing, there's a million carve-outs. So I think this idea, anyway, I just wanted to make sure the room is at least familiar with what we're talking about.
They're also extremely expensive. I would never pay Cooley to write legal opinion.
Yeah.
Just because it would have like 40 caveats and 50 carve-outs, and it would just be like a waste of money.
Well, it
But-
depends what you're asking us to opine on. So I was 18 years on our opinion committee.
Cooley's an excellent law firm, though. I've absolutely used them for advice.
But you're right, it's very
Right.
expensive.
Yeah.
So, legal opinions are very expensive because there's risk, obviously, to everyone. So, again, the problem with the token world, though, notwithstanding you get a legal opinion in Hong Kong, with the fact that tokens are traded throughout the world. We have close to 200 countries. Again, talk about being fragmented in the US. You have another 197 countries that you're dealing with, because I think there's 198 countries. And a lot of them are looking in this arena. And the fact that, gee, in Hong Kong you have this legal opinion, but the tokens are being traded to US investors, Canadian investors, and all it takes is for the SEC to find one unhappy US investor, and hey, they're going, hey, we got jurisdiction.
Thank you for that. I have another question for Juan, if I may. So there are US investors that use VPN or disguise their identity to buy tokens outside the US on non-US exchanges. Are you able to comment on whether or not you've ever been kind of approached by other executives at Coinbase to kind of find ways to stop that or inform US regulators that this is happening maybe at a greater scale than they might be aware of? Because it seems detrimental to Coinbase's business if a higher and higher percentage of US investors might be trading offshore and saying they're not US persons when they are, and just using these non-US exchanges that are more lax.
I don't, so no, I don't think we've had that discussion. I can tell you that when we are regulated and we play by according to a very stringent set of rules. Probably the highest standard right now is the BIT license, which is the license you need in New York to engage in the operation of selling virtual currency, essentially, or custody of virtual currency. And it's like a bank. There's capitalization obligations. There's all sorts of background checks. Half the people in the company get fingerprinted if they can touch the ability to deploy code. It's like very, it's an aggressive, there are all sorts of control issues we have to think about. We get examined by that regulator and a number of state regulators. So when we feel that somebody is breaking the rules and there is not a level playing field, we will, of course, I think anybody in that situation will say, hey, are you aware that there is a company that appears to be operating here? But we don't, it's not a situation where we're like, trying to get at VPN issues or other how individuals behaving. It's much more looking at how are other exchanges in the space operating, and are they complying with the rules that actually apply to the business, and are we operating fairly? I think that's the discussion we're trying to have.
Reasonably.
Yeah.
So you can't put such a high standard on them that they have to investigate everybody to the nth degree. So I think there is a reasonable standard that applies.
Okay. If you don't mind, we'll move on to Adam. So Adam, in your experience teaching as a professor at Bolt Law School, Berkeley Law School, teaching these blockchain courses to these brilliant law students, what are some common misconceptions that you see among law students? And then is there a difference between them and very bright people who are non-lawyers, such as pretty much everybody in this crowd, who might come from more of a programming background? Are there any themes that you can talk about?
Yeah, so just a bit of background. Before going to academia, I was a securities and venture finance attorney here in Silicon Valley. And so my interests, or I guess area of expertise, is really thinking about how securities laws applies, and then also thinking kind of economically, how does crypto displace or not displace traditional venture capital. And so I last semester I joined forces with two other professors at UC Berkeley, Greg LeBlanc from the business school, and then Don Song from computer science. And Don is working on a project, and they just raised $45 million in traditional venture capital, Oasis Labs. So I know her CTO, who was previously her postdoc, was just in the room. He had to run, but he told me to put a plug in that they're aggressively hiring to do something with all of that cash. So we put this class together, and there was 30 law students, 30 business school students, and 30 engineering students from computer science. And it was just awesome seeing those three groups work together, and we taught about securities laws, the kind of technical introduction, history of money, and then the students had to present basically collaborative projects, use cases for blockchain. So that was a lot of fun. Back to your question as far as kind of misconceptions, and I'm reminded about 8 months ago at UC Berkeley, our student group, Blockchain at Berkeley, hosted this conference, and they invited some folks from the SEC to speak, and they were speaking at the end of the day, and there was this energy in the room, and everyone was like, we're going to get guidance from the SEC, and we can't wait for them to talk. And I was thinking two things. I said, first, you're not going to get any guidance, and two, I don't think you want it yet. So I guess I'd push back. I mean, certainly, I think we could all argue that the SEC should be doing less, or they've kind of boxed out too much territory here. But I think the industry has benefited at least somewhat from the kind of regulatory ambiguity. I don't think we'd all be here, and I don't think, I think there's a bit of that, and certainly they could be doing worse, and maybe a different regime would have been more aggressive. So I think there's that. And then I think there's just a misunderstanding about how regulation works, right? So, there's this concept you all are sure familiar with about, what, is difference between a security token and a utility token. How do we define utility? I think you all could collaborate in this room and come up, probably wouldn't have the same definition. Imagine the SEC trying to figure that out. Do we want them to figure that out? So there's a lot of these challenging questions, but ultimately, I've seen a number of folks kind of come up with these articulate arguments, but ultimately it doesn't matter what you think, it matters what the regulators think. So I think that's one. I think two, just understanding that it's not a bright line test, so they're not going to come up with this definition and then everything on one side of the definition is going to be in violation, and there's going to be enforcement actions brought. It's what we call a facts and circumstances based test. So ultimately they look at the facts and circumstances of a given offering and then determine whether it's in violation. They're not necessarily looking at everything, but there's the kind of enforcement arm of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And I think what ultimately ends up happening is often they're looking at the kind of worst actors, or the folks that are most egregiously going against what we think of when we look at the Howey test and the securities rules. So I think that's a big part of it. Just a misunder, and that's why it's fun for, I think, us lawyers to talk to non-lawyers and just even explain the process. But I think Nancy's absolutely right about other jurisdictions looking to the U.S. and seeing what the U.S. will be doing, and I think that will probably change the space.
I actually have a quick follow-up question to that, which is what sort of obligation do you think regulators like the SEC have to us, to the ecosystem, to maybe draw brighter lines around some of this stuff? I think I heard you say that you think we benefited from some of the lack of clarity. I don't know that I see things quite that way. I think maybe some people did, others may not have.
I mean, you guys have done okay. You've built a pretty good business.
Coinbase has done great, but there's also, there's a great deal of frustration, I think, in our space around, well, when is a thing a security? And you rightfully point out, it's intensely facts and circumstances, and it's not like you can go and pick up the phone and be like, well, what do you think about this one? And if it's A, I'll go this way, and if it's B, I'll go that way. Just tell me.
Yeah.
I honestly don't care. Just tell me what the right answer is. At what point does the regulator have to, kind of affirmatively start to bring clarity to questions like that?
Well, I can opine, but maybe Nancy can start as a former regulator at the SEC.
Sure. Yeah.
There is no obligation.
Right.
What they've done is they are creating regulation by enforcement. And the speech from Hinman, which said, come to us and talk to us. Well, you know what? We had this conversation with the new crypto czar at the SEC, Valerie, and there's a panic, thank you. I can never say her name. And so I asked her, I said, do you plan on issuing any policy guidelines for us? I said, we can't be regulated by speeches and isolated enforcement actions. And she responded, she said, well, I'm not so sure you want the guideposts at this point, picking up on Adam's point, but maybe isolated issues, like custody of crypto, but we really want the technologists to come to us with a solution. We can't develop that. And I said, but you've stopped innovation here. I says, I don't know how many entrepreneurs that I've told go offshore. It's too hard in the US. I'm telling you, it's just too hard. And Dawn did a SAFT, by the way. She didn't do equity raise, right? Yeah. No. Well, the documents I saw, it was
I was not.
SAFT.
I have unfortunately no part of that.
Yeah. So she, but she's doing a blockchain. Protocols are, kind of different animals too. So, when I started out in the Division of Trading and Markets, so I was in the option area, and there was a rule that said if an exchange filed a rule proposal to us, we had 30 days to review it. We give comments, we publish it. Well, what did our division do? We took the law, which said 30 days, we took that as a suggestion. Some rule filings were in there for years. So is there an obligation for the SEC? Unless we keep hitting Congress saying, look, something has to move. And if we want to lose blockchain to the Russians as they want blockchain, they've articulated, hey, we're going to control blockchain just the way the US controls the internet. You know what? Continue on this course. Bill Hinman said, and again, he's the head of Division of Corporation Finance, who we're dealing with a lot, including, and we also are dealing with enforcement. I also challenge your hypothesis that they're only going after the fraudsters. They're not. There are cases that they're going after where the token had utility at the time it was minted, and they're still going after them. And, it's just outrageous. So, again, the Division of Corporation Finance told us that it's going to be several years before they do any kind of rulemaking or policy guidance. So what we have to do is, they said, look, come talk to us. So we have a case right now in front of Division of Corporation Finance. We put together a term sheet. They said, look, we don't want legal analysis, just put facts in front of us. So we went, we made a pitch. The woman who was lead at the meeting, she took me aside. She said, Nancy, we love the management team, clearly experienced. We love the product. We have a couple issues we'd like you to address. So we went back, we addressed their issues, submitted it. Then it's death by 1,000 cuts. Well, what about this? We're not happy with how long people have to hold the tokens. We're not happy about this. So we resubmitted now. And at some point, there's frustration by the entrepreneurs saying, fine, we're going to go. And I said, that's fine, but here's your risk. They know your name. They know where you live. They can refer you to enforcement. And I will tell you, one company that we're representing right now, they're in the 8th month of document production to the SEC. They're $1.5 million into this process. And the SEC, in my estimation, is probably 4 months away from no testimony yet. They haven't even deposed anybody yet. So they're probably 4 months away before even going in front of the commission. And what happens when the enforcement division, I feel like I'm doing all the talking. Are you guys interested in the enforcement side? Okay. So if the enforcement division says, we're going to the commission, we're going to get a case authorized, they notify the wrongdoers, in quotes, and they say, you have an opportunity to put a submission in before the commission. So it's called a well submission. So you submit that. The staff then sees what your arguments are going to be, and they respond to them in the memo that goes up to the commission. And back when I was there, we would get documents like, this thick by, the lawyers representing these guys. And then the staff gets it on a calendar. It goes into a closed calendar. So that means no public person is in the room when the SEC considers us. And I will tell you, probably 95% of the cases that get up to the commission get authorized. And and I was skeptical. And again, I started directly out of law school. And I was advising chairman on these cases, and I kept thinking, why is he listening to me? What do I know that, So, and there were cases that he said, fine, I'm not moving forward on this for the following reasons, but it's rare. On the crypto side, I think they're going to be very cautious only because they don't want to lose one. And what we find is the staff of enforcement now is really pushing hard. You got to settle. You got to sit out. We're going to make your life hell. And through their actions, they are making it hellish. But to me, the cases that we have right now, I'm telling the entrepreneurs, fight it. And if the SEC is going to go after you, do a GoFundMe account for legal fees. The community will support you. They don't want you acknowledging that your token, which is one of the 1,620 tokens out there, happen to be securities. And so then the other side of the equation, the SEC saying, hey, all of these tokens are securities. Okay, so tell us the path on how do you get the security tokens out there? Where can they be traded? What disclosures do you want? So they, there's Regulation A+, there's S1 registration statements. Well, there are those filings in before the SEC right now. They've been sitting there for 8 months. And we have heard, and again, we have some back channels, that they're pretty much saying, hey, these will never get out. We're going to kill them through comments. And IPOs aren't getting as many comments as the SEC is giving on these token offerings. Some IPOs we do, 15 comments. Yeah. There are 100 on token offerings, and they just keep going.
So I like,
please, Adam. I think it's tough. I'd say, to clarify what I said earlier, there is a little bit of be careful what you wish for. Nancy, you're not at the SEC anymore, and I'm sure the community probably wishes that you were. But I think it's tough, right? You have to balance, not stifling innovation with protecting, investors from fraud, and there is fraud out there. I've done I've looked a lot and compared the kind of newspaper ads in the 1920s for investment schemes with ICO advertisements on platforms, and they look very similar. It's unbelievable. Or you have almost identical language, and it's so on the one hand, you could imagine, and we've seen some regulators take the approach that we're gonna kind of baby in with the bathwater, or what is the expression? Throw the baby out with the bathwater, and just shut this down. At the other extreme, kind of a pure sandbox, wait and see. I think we're somewhere in the middle, maybe closer towards the more aggressive than maybe the industry would prefer, and I totally get that. But I still think we're somewhere in the middle. And
But when we were even advising on public token offerings, I drew by analogy to the securities market. We had one client, they said, Nancy, everybody uses this small group in Israel to fill out in effect, the order book for the tokens. That's how they get successful token offerings. So I'm going, yeah. So you got 5 guys in a room calling everybody, mass marketing, or sending out emails to everybody in the world. I'm going, no. Those are boiler room operations that we learned in the securities arena. You don't do those. The SEC will jump on you. Everybody does it. I'm going, you're not going to do it. So sure enough, that's one of the questions the SEC asks, are you utilizing these? And, you had to be smart about how you did those offerings in 2017. We did AML, KYC to the nth degree. And, and still the SEC, what that did is provided data mining for the SEC. They wanted all that information. And if you had a token offering that was significant, where there were a lot of people buying, That's a lot of information that they have.
So I have a question for each of you, and I'd like you to be as frank and as you can, if you, keeping in mind that this is not advice and you're not representing your employers, but why do you think it is that the SEC seems to give crypto such a much harder time than IPOs and all these other things? Do you guys have some theories or guesses?
Why don't I jump in real quick, and you guys can certainly opine or disagree. Look, I think a lot of people have in fact abused token offerings. They've created an investment scheme with a get-rich kind of a thing, and they've puffed up a bunch of statements about a thing, and they took a bunch of money, and it didn't work out. And that's exactly what the SEC exists to protect against. So they were created after the Great Depression, and there was a bunch of really crappy stuff happening in the securities markets, and Congress passed a couple of laws, and the SEC got created, and basically the job was let's protect the American investor from people that are making dubious statements about securities, and where there is an information asymmetry between the people selling the token or the security and the people buying it. And that's actually a pretty prudent policy, and I don't have a beef really with much of what the SEC has said. And so to answer your question, I think because you've seen some of the 1920s style advertising around some of this stuff, the SEC is reminded of all of the reasons why it exists in the first place, which is to protect consumers. So that's not actually my beef with the SEC. And I don't, to be clear, I don't think I have any beef with the SEC. But
I do.
It is being filmed, but you can keep it. We'll keep it.
Well,
Hi, SEC.
where I think there's a frustration on our part, it's the pace. It's the pace. So and that's a real challenge when, to give an example, adding assets for us in the U.S. It's a facts and circumstances for every single asset. And so, our business wants to just kind of let's add stuff. Our customers, it's the number one thing our customers want, more trading opportunity. We're in a position where, okay, I can provide a legal memo to the SEC with analysis and our point of view on whether or not this thing falls on on one side or the other. And we can also provide our own kind of analysis on the credibility of the token, of the development team. This is not a scam. The advertising around it is reasonable. We actually, we're not going to say that people aren't going to lose money. We would never make that claim. But we're comfortable supporting it. But even notwithstanding that kind of an effort, you will not get a productive response, or at least we have not gotten a productive response in the sense that we're comfortable definitively classifying something. And our company, although we're not the issuer, we can have liability supporting tokens that may be securities, provided that we're not, depending on licensure. So that's kind of the challenge that we run into. It's the pace, and this is such a fast-moving industry, and there are so many people doing so much stuff that the kind of the marriage of the Washington D.C. kind of regulation with the Silicon Valley pace is something that feels a little new to me in at least in this industry. And it's not like social media where you didn't have really heavy Wall Street style regulation. There was regulation, but not of the kind we're having to all deal with. And so that pace is the hardest part for us. And I'm not sure what the right answer is to that, to be perfectly candid.
I mean, it's a new technology. I think in the history of regulation is that it's slow in responding to new technology. I think back to my kind of the spectrum of being, supportive of innovation and risk adverse. I think the regulators are more incentivized to be risk adverse, right? They don't want to be seen as being asleep at the wheel or unresponsive if this thing implodes. So I think that's one of the challenges, that they're, I think, incentivized to be slow to respond, to be extra cautious, and it's a challenge for the folks that are coming from industry. For me in academia, I just get to sit back and enjoy, but it's a challenge.
Part of it's generational. The 40 people that they have at the SEC focusing on this, I swear the average age is probably 55.
Well, a lot of the young folks have left and are now doing crypto-focused law firms, advisory businesses.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. Yeah.
Our Congress, the average age is 73. And what they're interested in is, the drug runners and the terrorists and the money laundering. That's what we're worried about. Maxine Waters, who some of you know in California, Southern California, Congresswoman, that's what she's worried about. I was talking to Terrence beforehand, and I said she doesn't think the Inglewood gangs where she is based, they're not doing drug running. I'm sure there's some money laundering going on, and they're using fiat. Focus on them. Cure that problem. Yes, there's going to be problems in cryptocurrency, but we can't cure everything. So, again, the pace is very slow because they have a limited number of people. I think they have a total of 4,000 employees at the SEC. 40 are allocated to crypto issues, and they're learning it. Every time we go in, we meet with new people and we re-educate. And I try to bring in somebody who's in their 20s so that they can relate at some different level. And it's hard. It's a slow process.
Okay, so at this point, I think I'd like to open it up to audience questions.
Adam, you mentioned that some in the course that you were teaching, there were some interesting projects that came about between the law students and the tech students. What were some of the really cool projects?
It's cool because it really quickly got beyond just assessing, ICOs. So it was exciting, and I think the interesting things were kind of thinking about long-term use cases for blockchain. So there was a lot of cool stuff around supply chains, around setting payment interest, around payment for remittances to foreign countries. I'm trying to think of some of the other cool projects around creating a platform for licensing of intellectual property and managing the contracting that goes around that. I'm happy to share our syllabus is online, and it's got the videos from each class and all of the readings. So, and you're welcome to. It's on GitHub. We'll share it. Yeah, I'll send the link out. Yeah.
I'll just sort of speak. I have a relatively loud voice. I think it's really interesting to sort of. I think the current legal regulatory environment is well understood. It's well documented in the news and whatnot. One of the things that actually would probably be most interesting is kind of getting your guys' hypothesis on what judgments may come in the future. If you guys don't feel comfortable with that, on which questions may be settled in the future through the regulatory bodies.
Well, one question that we have not spent a lot of time talking about is the jurisdiction of the Commodities Futures and Trading Commission, the CFTC. And interestingly, they're the only one that has affirmatively actually asserted jurisdiction over everything. Bitcoin is in their domain. So that one question that has not yet, I think, has been as explored as deeply or as splashily as the securities stuff has been is, what is the CFTC going to do? How are they going to start to, how are they going to get involved in the regulation of spot markets for fraud and market manipulation, which they have authority to do that. And that is probably something that will, I think, get resolved in the coming couple of years, and we're not sure exactly what that's going to look like. So that's one example.
They have some forward thinkers, though, at the CFTC.
Oh, I think there's forward thinkers in all those agencies, Nancy. But
name one at the SEC.
Everyone I've met with has been very forward-leaning. But
he's going to use this. I swear to God, he's going to use that little clip. Oh, look, I said this.
But that's one. Also, weirdly, tax. There's a bunch of weirdness around. This is kind of one of these surprising, annoying things that none of us necessarily expected to have to spend an annoying amount of time thinking about. But tax is one of those areas where there are a lot of open questions, particularly around a company's reporting obligations that have not been kind of clarified. And I think that's probably a kind of year or two out issue that's going to be a big thing for us in the U.S.
Well, I think the exchanges will shake out too eventually in the near term. While he's an incumbent in the crypto space, there are dogs yapping at your feet. The old incumbents, the current stock exchanges, the NYSEs, the NASDAQ. All the broker dealers, they all have kind of committees focusing on how do they remain relevant in a crypto world. or a blockchain world. And, we're going to see them coming out, I think, with some challenging products. So so I think we'll see some certainty in the exchange area. Again, this onesie, twosies, being in front of the SEC on potential tokens that don't constitute securities. I mean, that's a hard way to live. On our committee, we probably represent, 500 entrepreneurs that have token projects. I told the SEC, you don't have enough hours in your day and to sit down with us and meet with us, consider what the project is, get into the minutia. So you have to think about guidance in the arena. So, custody is another issue that is relevant. Security is going to be another issue. There are so, and again, I give the regulators a hard time. And that's why I say that I started out at the SEC, and I happen to have a very high opinion of the SEC on the security side. But we need a regulator that's forward-thinking. I personally think we need a new agency. It'd be nice to deal with one agency in the crypto world. The likelihood of that happening anytime soon is probably.
Yeah.
I will add one other thing to this, though, that's probably more relevant for entrepreneurs, is that I do think collectibles, which is kind of this burgeoning thing going on in blockchain right now, is an area where I feel like the forces are aligned, where people want that to not be a security, and they want there to be kind of freeness around it. And so I do think we're very excited about some of the development we've seen there. And that's a place where I'm hoping there will be a lot more comfort developing in the next few months from a regulatory point of view.
I read that the memo that was leaked, because I think Nancy is being hard on regulators, but her group, and I engaged early on, but they've done a really excellent job engaging with the regulators, have provided some really thoughtful advice that I think kind of weighs both sides of things. So I'd encourage you to check that out.
This is the
Memo and then the safe harbor proposal.
Okay.
So, again, we'll send them to clearance, and then
Great.
if anybody wants them, you can get them from clearance.
And it's a challenge, because I think to the fact that to the end that the SEC is hearing from the president, Congress, it's more negative than positive. And so I think the industry's working kind of uphill here. So I think that's also something to think about.
Thanks a lot for being on this panel. I have a question for Nancy, actually. You mentioned that sometimes you advise your entrepreneurs to go offshore. I'm curious what that actually means. And just for context, I'm a founder of a blockchain protocol level, and we get this advice every now and then, but I have family, some of the other co-founders have kids. We're not, as much as we'd love to, move to Malta. It's not going to happen. So if domicile abroad is not on the table, does it actually mean anything to open up a, offshore?
So I think it's really hard to actually do what I say. So mainly because, it's just so easy for a U.S. investor to actually buy. And what ends up happening is the SEC just needs one. So moving to Malta, I have one client who they were about to do their token launch in January, and we stopped them. And we explored this thoroughly, because he goes, okay, fine, we'll move to Switzerland or Israel, or, and you start going through that, and it's really, really hard. So I actually I used it more as a talking point with the SEC, because fear is great when you're talking to regulators. Nobody wants to hear that, this innovation is going offshore, and it's certainly not in our best interest to have that happen. We want it here, and we're figuring out ways to do pre-sales in a better way. We're considering one right now at Cooley, which is kind of interesting. It was based on a conversation I had with Joe Grunfest. And, it may satisfy them at some level. They'll get off the critical path of, so the SEC's issue on a SAFT is they believe that the token is being sold at the same time as the right to acquire the token. So I'm going, okay, great, and they say, well, and then it's hard you're actually issuing two tokens then. If you have a fully functional network and you go ahead and you issue a token in that context, those early tokens will always be security tokens. And again, notwithstanding what the speech said. And we're going, well, tokens are mutable, they can change. And that's what Bill Hinman said. And it's like, well, we don't really believe that. So, so we think we've figured out a way to get around that now. And, you'll hear more from us if we actually feel really highly confident on it. We'll do a quick white paper so that people can jump on the bandwagon on that. But we're going to test it again with the SEC to make sure that it has more buy-in than certainly, notwithstanding we shared our SAFT white paper with the SEC, and they never gave comments. They still haven't given comments. They'll tell you privately, well, here's an issue. So,
And are you seeing more projects fundraised through traditional capital, and then and is that a bad thing necessarily? I mean, or is that what, because there's more scrutiny, more investor protection, arguably? I mean, early stage projects I guess what are you seeing on the ground?
So some projects are going the traditional equity route with those VCs really anticipating that there's going to be a token down the line.
Yeah. Which is a challenge to how do you structure the docs and
Exactly. Like I said, we think we may have figured out a way, and it's really quite interesting. So we're hoping that goes forward. Others, they continue to use the SAFT model. Again, we've tweaked our SAFT model to provide an investment decision down the line, meaning if your network becomes fully functional, which is kind of ironic, how do you become fully functional without the token being out there? If it's fully functional and you elect to, start trading, we have in the SAFT that the individual investor has an option to get a percentage of his or her money back, or they can convert into tokens. That's an investment decision being made at that point in time. We think that may work. We ran it by the SEC. They didn't throw up over it. So, more to come on that. But like I said, we're pursuing a different approach too, which looks more traditional, but will ultimately have the token concept built in there. So I don't know. It's we are certainly seeing some.
How much of the SEC's current stance is derived from the current administration?
I think none.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, arguably, right, the SEC is often appointed at leadership, former prosecutors, and Bill Hinman and Jay, they're both former deal lawyers. So, in some sense, you would argue that you'd think that this, current leadership would be more friendly than maybe past. I don't know, but yeah, in some sense, so yeah.
Oh yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So, what we're finding actually when we talk to congressmen, Democrats are opposed to crypto, and Republicans have an open mind, possibly because they want less government, but they don't want to stifle innovation. In Democrats, the conversation ends very quickly. It's fraud. It's like, well, no, it's not really.
And a follow-up to that, what is the SEC's current stance on the capital that's being offshored?
Being raised offshore, or what?
I'll put it this way: I think the SEC is not hugely sympathetic to the argument that other people might be getting away with something, and therefore I should too. They don't like to hear that, so to the extent that there is capital flight happening because out of a perception of kind kind of unwillingness to play ball, I don't think that they, or frankly any other federal regulator, really any regulator, is sympathetic.
But I think seeing less of the Instagram ads with Floyd Mayweather counting money and more stories of real entrepreneurs building projects and dealing with this idea. And I think it's another thing that this group is trying to do is connect the SEC with more real examples of entrepreneurs building real projects. So anyway, I think that's an important part of this.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thus, the corporate inversion trend doesn't come up in this dialogue.
I mean, you guys, you engage with more clients, so you might know this better than I do, but I have not had that discussion with them. I will say, we do, look, people want America to win. I think they do. And it is not lost on folks that the internet was huge, right? The internet was here and it was huge, and what a magnificent boon that has been for America. And I actually do think that we've gotten a lot of benefit of that for the industry. Many of the regulators got in very late, partially because nobody wanted to step in something. And so that is going for us. But on the other hand, some of the fraudulent behavior is a problem that can't be ignored. I'm not being an apologist for government by any stretch at all. Believe me, we're constantly working to kind of expedite stuff. But
it's like offshoring capital is a new thing, right? I mean, it's not the first time it's happened. So
What do each of you think would be the ideal regulations for crypto to make it successful, and what do you think the probability of that happening is?
I'll start. So again, I think the safe harbor that this coalition produced with strong enforcement to ensure that folks that are in violation of that are being addressed. But I do think it's probably moving in that direction. So again, I'd encourage everyone to check that out.
So again, I'm not opposed to government regulation in the crypto space. It's how heavy-handed it comes down to. I think there are disclosures that entrepreneurs can make in a token offering that I think are relevant. I don't think audited financial statements of the company that is doing the token offering are particularly relevant.
What financials?
Well, I have clients that they've been around for years and audited financials, but again, what relevance is it to buying a token that has by the way, don't say utility tokens anymore. It's consumptive tokens. The SEC doesn't like utility tokens. So, to have a consumptive use on a network, why is it relevant what's happening at the company? So I think disclosure will help. I think disclosure on how the funds are used, I think periodically it's important. I go back to the dot-com bust. The SEC had lots of disclosures with respect to those companies. Did it help in any way all of the investors that got hurt in that bust? It didn't. There was a lot of useless disclosures that I think they're going to try to layer on the crypto arena, and I just don't think it makes sense. I'd like to see some really thoughtful approach to what's relevant to this area. And then on the security side, if there's security tokens for a period of time, and again, our safe harbor, we have 3 tranches: securities, fully functional, and decentralized. And in each step, the regulation becomes less. Okay, so and if something happens to be a security token, we need again some ability to have investors trade those tokens. We need, some old laws relating to transfer agents perhaps changing. So there's a bunch of stuff. Say there's one particular thing, I'm not sure there is, because there's so many facets to this whole arena.
I'll give a very quick answer to that. And I love that question because we're an operator and it matters very much to us. I think there are 3 attributes that matter the most for this. It's got to be clear, it's got to be harmonized, and it's got to be economically viable for us to comply with. So we have to know what's regulated and what's not regulated. We have to know what the rules are. It's almost at the level where I care less about what the rule is than knowing what the rule is. Economically feasible, there are some states that have developed policies around that come through the money transmission laws that are not economically feasible, and so we don't operate in Hawaii because they have a policy that is not economically feasible to operate a Bitcoin company in Hawaii. And they have to be harmonized, so I don't want to have 50 states with 50 radically different things. And if you can solve those three problems, it's almost like I kind of pick whatever rules you want. If you get those three things, this will succeed, right? But those are the enemies of success. In terms of the likelihood, I think we actually are likely to get to that. Wyoming has passed a law at the lobbying of Coinbase to fix prong 2 of that, the economic feasibility issue. Clarity is slowly happening. So it's, I think, I'm an optimist, so I think it's a question of time, but it will be painful.
But until Congress acts, though, just think about the blue sky laws, how long it took to harmonize. And it was finally Congress that said, hey, preemption applies, and you, the states, don't have jurisdiction to do the following things. I mean, that's what's going to be hard.
Agree. I think it is. I think it'll take a while.
Yeah.
I do.
So one of the key questions that we've been discussing for SEC is that whether a token is utility token or like consumptive token or security token. So that's one of the key questions. So I'm just wondering for blockchain entrepreneurs, what are the other questions that we should bear in mind, because there are so many other government agencies also involved in this landscape?
I think it depends a ton on what you're doing. Start with how do you want to raise capital? Move on to what is your product? Who are you trying to reach? What services are you trying to provide? And depending on your answers to those, there's probably like 60 different agencies. So that's an unhelpful kind of answer, but that is the truth, which is why people end up, unfortunately, having to deal with a lot of lawyers when they do blockchain stuff. At a higher level, I think the more you can articulate crisply what your product is and who you're trying to serve and what your revenue model is, the easier it will be for you to talk to a lawyer and get advice on what you should worry about. It gets very hard to give advice when an entrepreneur, this is hard because entrepreneurs are constantly changing their mind about what the product is. But it's hard to give legal advice when you shift the product around a lot. So that's one of the biggest challenges we all face starting new stuff.
Yeah. Who's familiar with, is everyone familiar with GDPR? Is the new European privacy regime? Right, so even this is the challenge with a new, quickly growing technology is there's even, and I'm not a privacy attorney, but there's a question there, right, that if you're handling if you're handling private data and the consumer asks you to delete that data, you have to comply or else you're arguably in violation of GDPR. Well, you can imagine with some platforms that may be difficult, and then the question of, well, anyway, so there's just even with this huge regime, there's just, it's from being at a law school, I joke that it's like the perfect hypothetical for 10 different subjects. So it's
How do you delete it from a blockchain?
So when you look at traditional fundraising venture, there are time-tested best practices, and they're there because they work, right? Like for example, when you want to build a company, you raise a small seed round and you build a prototype and you prove it, and then you raise a bigger round, etc. As opposed to you don't raise like a $45 million round on day one, and then the investors get to flip it like the next day, right? So these best practices, if they can be enforced in crypto-based fundraising as well, that could do a lot of good. Do you think there's an opportunity for regulators to enforce such practices?
You mean like mimic things, like incorporate lockups, and are you saying
Sure.
taking...
And performance-based, release of funds and
Or mimic the crowdfunding type regulations, I would imagine, where you start small and then you can move up
Right.
the
Essentially, essentially practices that incentivize entrepreneurs to commit to a project long term, also investors to commit to a project long term, and the financial incentives would be staged such that you actually have to build and deliver a product.
I think we're seeing, I mean, if you, in 30 seconds, I'll try to explain the securities laws, at least the 33 Act, right? So it's prohibited to offer or to sell securities to anyone unless you've filed a registration statement, gone public, right, done an IPO, or you have an exemption from the rules, or you're not a security. But if we get past the argument of whether you're a security or not, right, in the traditional venture space, there's exemptions for selling to accredited investors, and that's where we do, this is the private offering exemption, and so most institutional, Series A financings are done via this exemption. But most founders, early employees of companies aren't, who are exchanging their labor and investing in a company that way, aren't accredited investors. So there's an exemption for that. And I think the industry is trying to articulate, we should distinguish between a minor, airdrops, employees, et cetera. So I think we are seeing. I mean, it seems like that is happening.
Okay, thank you very much to our panelists, Adam, Juan, and Nancy. Let's give them a big hand, please.